In this video, I will be talking about angle relationships. Before we get there, I want you to recall two things. The first is the angle addition postulate. This says that any angle is the sum of its parts. So in this diagram, the measure of angle ABD plus the measure of angle DBC is equal to the measure of angle ABC. So the top angle plus the bottom angle is equal to the entire angle. Again, an angle is the sum of its parts. The second thing I want you to remember is how we classified angles. We can classify an angle as acute, which means that it's less than 90 degrees, a right angle, which means it is equal to 90 degrees, an obtuse angle, which means it is greater than 90 degrees, and a straight angle, which means it is equal to 180 degrees. So now let's talk about angle pair relationships. Angles can be adjacent or non-adjacent to one another, where adjacent means they share a common vertex and side but have no common interior points. So in this pink figure here, they do share a common side and they share a common vertex. A non-adjacent angle does not share a common side or does not share a common vertex. Complementary angles are angles whose measure adds up to 90 degrees. So again, they can be adjacent or non-adjacent. An adjacent angle who's complementary to another will form a 90-degree angle, where this top angle plus this bottom angle, those measures add up to 90 degrees. Non-adjacent angles can also be complementary. So let's say this is 50 degrees and this angle right here is 40 degrees. The sum of those two angles add up to 90 degrees, so they are complementary, even though they don't touch. Likewise, angles can be supplementary. Supplementary angles are angles whose measures add up to 180 degrees. So again, they can be adjacent, where they do share a common side and a common vertex, or they can be non-adjacent, where they do not share a common side or do not share a common vertex. In this case, again, this could be 110 degrees and this could be 70 degrees. So for example, let's say given this figure, we want to name the angle pair relationships. So right off the bat, I notice that the measure of angle CBD plus the measure of angle RST is equal to 180 degrees, because 122 plus 58 is 180. Therefore, angle CBD and angle RST are supplementary. I also notice that the measure of angle ABC plus the measure of angle RST is equal to 90, because 32 plus 58 is equal to 90. Therefore, angle ABC and angle RST are complementary. Another question I could ask is, what is the angle measure that would be supplementary to angle ABC? So the measure of angle ABC again is 32 degrees, and we need to find something supplementary to angle ABC. So we need to add some angle to 32 degrees to get 180. So if we subtract 32 from both sides, we get 148. So an angle whose measure is 148 would be supplementary to angle ABC. There are two other angle pair relationships we can talk about. The first is that of a linear pair. So two adjacent angles are a linear pair if their non-common sides are opposite rays. So in this figure, angle 1 and angle 2 are a linear pair because they are adjacent, because of this side, and their non-common sides form opposite rays with one another. Linear pairs are also always supplementary. The next relationship we can talk about is that of vertical angles. Two angles are vertical angles if their sides form two pairs of opposite rays. So in this figure, angle 1 and angle 3 are vertical angles because the sides of angle 1 form pairs of opposite rays with angle 3. So angle 1 is vertical to angle 3. You can also say that angle 2 is vertical to angle 4 for the same reason. Vertical angles are special because they are always congruent to one another. So in this case, angle 1 is congruent to angle 3 because they are vertical. And angle 2 is congruent to angle 4, again because they are vertical. So for example, given this figure, let's figure out which angles are linear pairs and which angles are vertical. So linear pairs again form a straight line and only contain two angles. So angle 1 and angle 5 are linear pairs. Again, these also add up to 180, so they are also supplementary. Angle 5 and angle 4 also form a straight line and add up to 180, so they are also supplementary. The only vertical pair in this figure is angle 1 and angle 4 because the sides of angle 1 form opposite rays with the sides of angle 4. And again, this means that angle 1 is congruent to angle 4. Another example involves solving equations. So in this example, we want to solve for x, given that the two angles in the figure below form a linear pair. So we can use what we know about linear pairs in order to solve this. So we know that linear pairs add up to 180 degrees. So this angle plus this angle should equal 180. So 5x plus x should equal 180 degrees. If we combine like terms, we get 6x. Divide both sides by 6. So we get x is equal to 30. And that's our answer. The last thing we need to talk about is interpreting diagrams. So given this diagram on the left, there are some things that we absolutely can always assume. First, all points A, B, C, D, and E are all coplanar, meaning they all live in the same plane. You can also assume that points A, E, and D are all collinear, meaning they are on the same line. And you can also assume that every line intersects at point E. However, you cannot assume that segment AE is congruent to AD. You cannot assume that angle 2 is congruent to angle 1. And you cannot assume that the measure of angle 1 is 90 degrees. You can only assume these things you can only assume these things if they are marked. So you can only assume that the measure of angle 1 is 90 degrees if it is marked as a right angle. You can only assume that angle 2 is congruent to angle 3 if they are marked similarly. And you can only assume that segment AE is congruent to AD, again if they are marked similarly, like so. So as a recap, here are all the things that we've talked about. We've talked about complementary angles, which are angles whose measures add up to 90 degrees. We talked about supplementary angles, which are angles whose measures add up to 180 degrees. We talked about adjacent angles, which are angles that share a side and an endpoint. linear pairs, which are adjacent angles whose non-common side form opposite rays and are always supplementary. We also talked about vertical angles whose sides form pairs of opposite rays and are always congruent. And we talked a little bit about what we can assume in diagrams and what we can't assume. So this is all that there is to angle pairs and angle relationships.